Separation in Adolescence by Mara Sidoli. Read by Miranda Davies. I should like to focus on how the reintegrative processes of the self unfold in adolescence, and how these influence the ego at that particular state of its development. Jung, and Jungians in general, have in the past focused mainly on adolescent states of mind as observed in adult patients in analysis, who, as Jung saw it, were in the grip of the child archetype with its positive creative forward goals or negative stuckness implications. Marie-Louise von Franz has also described patients like these who became stuck in adolescent states and identified with the eternal child archetype, the easily recognizable adult patient who is afraid of growing old and who tends to identify with youthful heroes and their deeds in search of everlasting youth. We have therefore to distinguish between adolescence proper and adolescence as a state of mind, one which we can define as archetypal. With regard to adolescence proper, Jung wrote that conscious differentiation from the parents normally takes place in adolescence with the eruption of sexuality. In his paper, The Theory of Psychoanalysis, in response to Freud's views on infantile sexuality, Jung wrote that, although a relatively early budding of eroticism exists in the child early on, this element gains in strength as years go on, so that the Oedipus complex soon assumes its classical form. The conflict takes on a more masculine and therefore more typical form in a son, whereas a daughter develops a specific liking for the father, with a correspondingly jealous attitude towards the mother. We could call this the Electra complex. As everyone knows, Electra took vengeance on her mother Clytemnestra for murdering her husband Agamemnon, and thus robbing her, Electra, of her beloved father. Both these fantasy complexes become more prominent with increasing maturity, and reach a new stage only in the post-pubertal period, when the problem arises of detachment from the parents. This stage is characterized by the symbol of sacrifice. The more sexuality develops, the more it drives the individual away from his family and forces him to achieve independence. End of quote. The problem of detachment from the parents, as Jung puts it, renews and recapitulates all experience of separation for the child from birth onwards. In the inner world, unconscious archetypal motifs will therefore be constellated at these phases of development, which will reflect the various stages of the resolution of past conflicts, compounded with anxieties and conflicts related to the new stage. In Fordham's book, Children as Individuals, we find an important statement on adolescence which has needed little or no modification since it was written. The roots of the adolescent's uncontrollable turbulence lie in infancy, when his mother and later other members of his family comprised his society. It was in relation to them that the prototype of later patterns of development were laid down. In all early periods, maturational processes pressed him away from pre-personal ruthless drives towards forming perceptions of himself and his mother as a person, about whom he has felt concern. Now, at adolescence, the pre-personal structures revive in response to the less personal role he is expected to fulfill. So the infantile roots are needed if he has to find his identity in new patterns of living. Omnipotent fantasies result in attacks on parents and on society that stem from the manic defenses of infancy, the sources of hero and heroines. Depressive episodes, depersonalizing, hysterical and splitting episodes and splitting of the ego are not at all infrequent, and often constitute a kind of normal insanity. The ruthlessness characteristic of these stages is proverbial, and when they predominate, an adolescent needs support and a kind of indirect holding, such as a mother provides for her infant in crises, rather than the direct control of discipline, which only provokes more rebellion. An adolescent comes into direct contact with the culture pattern and the collective unconscious. End of quote from Fordham. In other words, with the upsurge of sexuality, the young person has to undergo a major deintegration in order to be able to integrate all the major changes which are occurring both in his body and in his or her new experience of life. This deintegration will activate once again archetypal motifs in the unconscious related to the difficult task of acquiring grown-up sexual and intellectual abilities, compounded with the urge to live these acquirements out, move away from home, and sever the childhood ties with the parents. It is a stage of renegotiation of lifestyle, identity, which brings about conflictual and powerful emotional and anxiety states. Unconscious fantasies and primitive collective archetypal motifs become activated, and a regression-progression dichotomy sets in and is usually acted out and dramatized in relation to parents, teachers, and society. Shifts from excited to depressed states, from impotence to omnipotence, from insecurity to arrogance, from extreme passivity to frantic activity, and so on, occur frequently and often to extreme degrees. The novelty of the experience constellates the archetypes of the hero and the heroine, and we all know how much hero worship is a feature of adolescence, from football players to pop singers, actors, and politicians. The adolescent fan tends to create his own heroes. These heroes, with whom he then identifies, seem to serve the purpose of providing supportive models of someone who has already successfully accomplished the task of life the adolescent is to accomplish. These idealized hero figures are those the young person can model himself on and draw strength from, in opposition to the parents, the devalued heroes of the past, who need to lose their idealized role in order to be left behind by the adolescent, together with the childhood dependency upon them and their authority. The parallel to the hero motif is the motif of sacrifice, which will be constellated as it relates to all initiation rituals. For instance, primitive archetypal motifs related to the hero archetype, portraying images of death, mighty fights, abandonment, and loss, surface in dreams and fantasy, creating conflicts and distress in the adolescent both internally and externally by issues related to his newly constellated need for independence. Such conflict may activate at the unconscious level archetypal images of the death of the child, the aim of which is to bring to consciousness and so allow a working through of the ending of childhood as a stage of life. At times this experience can bring about extreme despair, and the adolescent, taking it concretely and overwhelmed by distress, may be led to put an end to his or her own life. In such cases, the symbolic metaphorical level is not attained, and instead of the birth of the hero-heroine, which would promote a step forward, what takes place is the death and sacrifice of the young person's life. Suicide is, in fact, one of the greater causes of death in adolescence, whether conscious or unconscious, through accident, drug taking, and so on. In turn, the unconscious, in the working through of the infantile dependency, may bring to consciousness images of the death of the parental couple, and this again is likely to overwhelm with guilt the adolescent who interprets it concretely. It may even push those who are most disturbed to act out and commit a crime. This tends to happen because, as Fordham states in the passage mentioned above, the pre-personal structures revive in response to the less personal role the adolescent is expected to play. So the infantile roots are needed if he has to find his identity in a new pattern of living. Infantile roots means a regression to a pre-symbolic, undifferentiated mode of experiencing which pertains to infancy and is therefore archetypal. The murder of the parents, which means in infantile language getting rid of the parents in rage by usurping their power, is a motif which belongs to the unconscious fantasies of the pre-Oedipal and Oedipal stage of development, and which becomes regressively activated again in adolescence in relation to the need in the young person to acquire full genital potency. The unconscious fantasy of the murder of the parents may be disguised, as for instance in the statement of an adolescent who says that he or she cannot leave home or do whatever they want to because they fear that their parents may be broken-hearted or may not be able to survive their moving away. Hence they must sacrifice themselves in order to protect and save the parents. The confusion here arises because the adolescent is projecting the regressed part of himself onto the parents, as well as disowning his or her murderousness and the wish to get free of parental dependency, which is felt as bad, and is identifying with the good wish to look after the parents as a way of dealing with the unconscious guilt generated by the bad wish. Another confusion which commonly arises is that between the real parents and the parental imagos, apropos of which Jung writes, "In reality, the whole drama takes place in the individual's own psyche, where the parents are not parents at all, but only their imagos. They are representations which have arisen from the conjunction of parental peculiarities with the individual predisposition of the child. The imagos are activated and varied in every possible manner by an energy which likewise pertains to the individual. It derives from the sphere of instinct and expresses itself as instinctuality." End of quote. Parallel with the motif of the death of the parental couple is that of the death of the child, which is generated by regressive tendencies and which brings to the fore early infantile fantasies of starvation, abandonment, and helplessness. Directly deriving from them are anxieties consciously manifested by the adolescent of not being able to make it, fears of not finding a job, and not being able to provide for one's daily bread. These anxieties in normal situations promote positive action in the adolescent when he manages to identify positively with a caring adult part in himself, but in pathological cases may paralyze him and induce extreme passive and negative self-destructive behavior of all kinds. Jung states clearly that the road of regression leads back to childhood and finally, in a manner of speaking, into the mother's body. Whoever gives up the struggle to adapt and regresses into the bosom of the family, which in the last resort is the mother's bosom, expects not only to be warmed and loved, but also to be fed. If the regression has an infantile character, it aims, without of course admitting it, at incest and nourishment. End of quote. Hence, the more the adolescent is stuck in a regressive state, the more such defensive mechanisms as denial, manic triumph, and omnipotent grandiose fantasies will constitute attempts to manage guilt and shame in order to overcome ego failure. It is usually these adolescents who are stuck or fail to find a satisfactory way out of the conflict who come into therapy, or more often are brought to the therapist for help. So far I've tried to describe how the change of life that is adolescence happens to be experienced in the inner world at fantasy level, and the kind of drama that needs to be enacted on the stage of the psyche so that the person can move on to the next phase of life. As I have pointed out, it is the archetypal contents of the drama which blurs the line between reality and unconscious fantasy. The ego, owing to the de-integrative processes, is in great turmoil, hence weakened in attempting to withstand the pressure from the unconscious, and breaks down and often disintegrates. This is why we often witness a confusion of stage, and the inner drama is then acted out in reality. In fantasy, the death of the child and of the old parents will eventually give rise to the birth of new ones, the new youth and the new couple, who can only be born out of the ashes of the old ones. I trust it will be clear by now that the bodily pole of the archetype embedded in the body and monitoring the instinctual drives and bodily changes goes hand in hand with the spiritual change, whereby the instinctual and physical experiences acquire a mental representation in a metaphorical way. Thus, the transformative processes inherent in the de-integrative-reintegrative process can attain to a new and more adapted level of integration, and life can go on. However, the achieving of adult genital identity is the major developmental task and an extremely difficult one to reach smoothly. As we have seen, a regressive tendency in the unconscious can easily set in and reverse this life task, with the aim of keeping the adolescent in the grip of extreme anxiety, stuck between the parents and unable to move on, both externally and internally. This regressive tendency is often reinforced by concurrent anxiety in the parents, caused by the obviously worrying behavior of the conflicted youth, but also due to the parents' own identification with the adolescent, or reactivation of unresolved adolescent conflicts in themselves, which they may try to control by projection onto their children, adopting a clinging or rejecting mode of behavior in relation to the distressed and disturbed child. Letting go requires sacrifice on both sides, and a great deal of pain is experienced by both parents and children alike in the process, similar to that when an actual child is being physically born. For a new, major change is taking place in the relationship between the couple. A major deintegration will happen also in the mother and the father, who will have to accommodate themselves to the changed family situation and prepare themselves to enter the second stage of life. To manage this readjustment takes time and entails taking risks on both sides, the accepting of limitations and responsibilities by both parties, which are inherent in the new situation, as well as accepting the advantages and disadvantages which the change may bring about. It is here that Jung's emphasis on the fantasy of sacrifice appears to me to be pertinent. In his paper on the etiology of neurosis, he writes, "The unconscious fantasy of sacrifice, occurring some time after puberty, is a direct outcome of the infantile complexes. The fantasy of sacrifice means the giving up of infantile wishes. I have shown this in my book Symbols of Transformation, and at the same time have pointed out the parallels in the history of religion." In Symbols of Transformation, Jung writes, "The natural course of life demands that the young person should sacrifice his childhood and his childish dependency on the physical parents, lest he remain caught, body and soul, in the bonds of unconscious incest." This regressive tendency has been consistently opposed from the most primitive times by the great psychotherapeutic systems which we know as the religions. They seek to create an autonomous consciousness by weaning mankind away from the sleep of childhood. The sun breaks from the mists of the horizon and climbs to undimmed brightness at the meridian. Once this goal is reached, it sinks down again towards night." End of quote. The absent father and the crucifixion of the hero-heroine. I would now like to report the dream of a 17-year-old boy taken from the second year of his twice-weekly therapy. The dream. "My mother is in bed. She looks like crying. I go close to her and comfort her. Suddenly I scream with pain. My back! My father's huge penis has violently penetrated my anus, pierced my belly, and penetrated my mother's vagina. And there I am, terrified and in agony, nailed between them in their intercourse." The boy was uneasy in reporting the dream and still very shattered by its contents. He associated it with his behavior in having put himself in that situation in order to comfort the mother, who, he felt, was upset because his father had ill-treated her. The image of the crucifixion summarized well the position in which the boy was stuck and the reason why he had been referred to me. I would now like to go back to my first meeting with Larry and show you how this clinging to the mother and his coming between the parents was still happening in reality, and how it developed in the transference. Before meeting him, I had received a telephone call from a male colleague who told me that I should be receiving a telephone call from a woman about her son who needed help, but that I should not tell the boy who had referred him to me, because he knew the boy's father, and the father would never have forgiven him for the referral, as the father always pretended that there was nothing wrong with the boy, except that he was lazy and good for nothing. The whole business had a conspiratorial flavor. Then the mother rang me to complain mainly about Larry's massive failure at school and his laziness. I suggested that, given his age, the boy might like to telephone me so that I could assess if he felt that he had a problem, and whether he wanted help with it. She seemed to feel that this was not necessary, that I was being difficult, and that I should take her word for it. I then had to explain that I could only treat Larry provided he wanted me to help him, and eventually she accepted my views, though not without some surprise. Larry eventually called me, and we agreed that he should come to see me, and that we would take it from there. He arrived at the appointed time, accompanied by his mother, a verbal, determined, sophisticated, and emotionally cold, businesslike lady, behind whom I felt he tended to hide himself. He was an attractive boy with a wiry body, and dressed rather scruffily in jeans and plimsolls, compared with the impeccable elegance of his mother, and he had a challenging look in his lovely big blue eyes, and a provocative wisp of brown hair. He seemed to wish to impress me with an I couldn't care less kind of attitude, while his mother began telling me about his failures at school, which she identified as the problem, and all that she and her husband had tried to do to help him, and how they had failed. Short of tying him down to his desk with his schoolbook in front of him, she had tried every ploy, including spending a small fortune in private coaching. But he kept on failing, and she had come to the conclusion that she had better try psychotherapy, about which she was not very convinced, and neither was her husband, but she had been told it helped with difficulties at school. I had to stop her in order to ask Larry for his version of the story, but he seemed really not to know what was going on, except that I felt he looked rather humiliated by his mother's report. I pointed this out to him, adding that it must not feel good for him to be publicly humiliated, and I did not believe that he didn't care. At the beginning of the interview, he sat on the double settee next to his mother while she was talking, like a little boy holding on to Mummy's skirt. Now he appeared to relax and began to look around, and at length, when his mother left the room and I proceeded to interview him on his own, he moved from the settee to an armchair opposite me. I found this move interesting, and associative of his own interest in the therapy, something from which a therapeutic alliance between the two of us might develop. Adopting his mother's manner of reporting, he carried on enumerating almost proudly all his school failures. These were really major failures, as he was 3 years behind in his schoolwork, and had behaved so badly in the classroom that he had now been expelled from school. They, he said, meaning the headmistress and the teachers, were a bunch of pigs, so it did not really matter, and anyway his classmates were a boring lot, because they were all babies, 3 years younger than he was. He told me that his real interest was in photography and political revolution. School was really boring, and his parents and the teachers just had to resign themselves to the fact that it was not for him. His father had given him up long ago, and he did not think he was academically inclined like his sister. His sister, too, was boring. She only talked of architecture, and she was a show-off anyway. I commented that I could not see why he had to be a failure in school if he could be good at politics and photography, but we could find out about this if he came to see me. To this he replied, "I think I will come, but don't think I'm coming because I want to go back to school." I said that I was not a teacher or a parent, and that my only interest was to find out, with his help, what was going on inside him which was preventing him, whom I felt was a bright young man, from succeeding at school, since in my view being good at school was nothing very extraordinary. He looked bemused, but agreed to see me, and throughout the 2.5 years he was under treatment kept an impeccable record of attendance. In the sessions he soon became very controlling and possessive of me. In the room he nailed me to my chair with his constant stare, which I experienced as controlling and always trying to show me up. If I was not all the time on the ball, he would pick at me and contradict and demand my total attention. He felt like a demanding baby wanting his mother's eyes constantly focused on him. He played about with the time, arriving late and not wanting to leave when the hour was up. He had always something extremely important to tell me at the last minute, which seemed to require extra time, and when I pointed out to him that he was manipulating the time by arriving late and wanting to leave late, he became very angry and gave me a tirade on political issues. We soon came to talk about his revolutionary stance. Did I know how keen a revolutionary he was? He had been caught by the police in a riot with a youth throwing Molotov cocktails. Well, he was only throwing stones, but I should not mess about with him. This was the message I picked up, and I interpreted it back to him as him wanting to scare me and put me in my place. He said that his family had a tradition of rebels and patriots and brave people who were not afraid to fight tyrants. His paternal grandfather was a hero and had committed suicide in jail, having been arrested by the dictator's police and preferring to kill himself rather than give away his comrades' names. He was a hero and had been an anarchist who had died for his beliefs in the cause of freedom from oppressors. Like myself and the sort of people who tell you what to do, I added. You could say so, he answered, giving me a fierce look while tensing up as if ready to strike me. I felt I had touched on a sore area, so I commented that it must have been very sad for his own father to have lost his daddy in that way. A child surely would have mixed feelings about a father who is a hero but at the same time abandons him in order to die for some reason incomprehensible to him. Besides, if he was a just man, why was he in prison? My comment made him thoughtful, and then he told me the painful story of his heroic grandfather who killed himself swallowing the crushed glass of his own spectacles. He died a horrible death, said Larry proudly, with his eyes full of tears, but he did not speak. To avenge him, his sister became a partisan, and she too supported the cause of the oppressed with great bravery. They are mentioned in history books. Larry's father was a baby at the time and never really met him, but he suffered because the grandmother became depressed and he had to look after her. She wanted him close to her always, and so did all the old aunts. It appeared that the pain and distress for his grandfather's death had been locked up in Larry and in his family for all those years, and they could only allow themselves to feel proud of his bravery. The thought of the violent death he suffered was too painful to be kept in mind, and it also made a glorification of suicide. After this session, he allowed me to speculate with him about what the child in his father, as well as the child in himself, felt about the absent father, both his dead grandfather and his own father, who until then had been pretty absent from his sessional reports. He told me that his father was an important man and seldom at home. He was a famous lawyer and university lecturer who was always busy and had lots of political friends and students to entertain him. When he was at home, he went into his study and read hundreds of books and listened to classical music and could not tolerate any noise in the house. Larry hated reading books and loved pop music. His father had often told him off because he was making a noise. He had never played with him that he could remember. He would talk for hours on intellectual matters, both with his mother and sister. He despised Larry's ignorance, his left-wing political views, and was rather a liberal. They had nothing in common, because even when Larry had shown him his photographs, he admired them, as they were really beautiful, but he had not given them too much importance, and had told him that instead of wasting time with that hobby, he ought to apply himself to schoolwork and more useful and worthwhile activities. While he was talking about his father, I perceived in his voice and bodily posture a mixture of envy, admiration, rage, and despair. I put it into words for him, saying that he felt his father had no faith in him, and that this prevented him from having any confidence in himself and his intellectual potential and capacities. He was deeply touched by this interpretation, but denied it vehemently, saying that he did not care, that he did not have any respect for his father's political views, and his father was a coward and an egotistical man, a dictator. All this came out with a mixture of spite, hatred, rage, and an emotional vehemence that prompted me to say that he seemed to be too hot about the issue not to care, as he asserted. This turned him against me, and he threatened to walk out if I did not stop such talk immediately. I had now become the hated father in the transference. He stopped talking to me, pulled his legs and arms closer to his chest, and gave me a defiant, murderous look with such strength that I experienced there and then a sort of blow on the head. He kept silent, looking at a point on the wall a few inches above my head. His expression changed as if he had seen something frightening. He said there was a crack in the wall above my head. After a while he began talking again and mentioned that somebody he had seen on his way to see me today had been hit on the head. It was a man, and there had been a nasty fight. He felt quite upset as he told me. Now I was able to link up his murderous look, my sensation of having been knocked on the head, his violent anger and hatred for his father's intellect, the fact that I had become his hated clever father in the transference, and that he wanted to murder me. It was my thinking capacity, which he experienced as cold and penetratingly persecutory, that had stirred up his emotional upheaval. He had felt cornered by me in the session, as he feels in the presence of his superior father. Yet I told him that by attacking my head and his father's mind, he was also attacking his own mind, and this was why he kept feeling inferior. Following this session, a great deal of material surfaced about the relationship between his parents and how he perceived his father exploiting his mother, and yet being stuck to her and dependent on her all the time. Since he could remember, his mother had always had to accompany his father wherever he was going, and leave him and his sister at home with nannies because of his father's social engagements. His father's professional success counted with his parents more than anything else, and he, Larry thought, did not count at all. Fortunately, his nanny was really lovely and loved him. In fact, she was wonderful to him. Then, when he was about 5, his mother dismissed her because she had become jealous. Apparently the nanny was beautiful, and his father had noticed her. So Larry lost her and was then looked after by servants whom he did not like at all, while his mother was out with his father. I commented that the picture he conveyed to me was of his father successfully taking his mother away from him at a time when he really needed her, and that his mother had colluded with his father in abandoning him. However, this message was also complicated by the other stories he had told me about his father ill-treating his mother and making her cry. In the transference, he was extremely curious about my other patients. He asked about my husband, and with ingenious questioning of the concierge, found out about my whole family. It was quite clear that he could not tolerate my having any other relationships. He came out occasionally with snippets of information about my life, and I felt I was being closely observed and spied upon. He even admitted driving on purpose around my block at night with friends to check if I was in and asleep, and he tried to figure out, by looking at the lights that he could see, which room I slept in. All this material which he brought to the sessions allowed us to work on his jealousy and rivalry with both father and sister for possession of the mother, and his feeling constantly a loser, and also on his wish to be as potent as his father, and not only to be admired and loved and looked after by both his mother and sister, but also by the world at large, and of course by me, who he constantly complained was not really interested in him. He also complained of not having friends, at least not as many as his father or sister, because they were both successful and admired. Most of all, he did not have a girlfriend, and he found that especially humiliating. All this material culminated in the dream which I reported when introducing the case of Larry, and which occurred towards the end of the 2nd year of his therapy. This dream brought to his consciousness in a striking and synthetic way all the themes on which we had been working, and he was eventually able to integrate it. In the process, he began to move away from his mother and became interested once more in learning. He successfully regained the years he had lost at school and progressed with his education. In order to obtain a positive feeling for his father, he used an ingenious scheme. He asked his father if he could use his office in which to do his homework, as at home he had too many distractions and temptations, like the television and gramophone records. His father agreed, and this meant that after he had finished his homework, the two of them could spend time together and so become closer. His attitude towards his father changed quite dramatically. Now he was the good one, and would have liked to put all the blame and resentment onto the mother for their past conflicts. The two men were going through the phase previously unthinkable of ganging up against the mothers, myself included. Although this shift created some problems in the therapy, such as acting out and missing sessions, his homosexual love for the father was eventually understood by him, as well as his own wish in the present and in the past to set the parents against one another in order to win their love. I said this must have started when he was small, the baby in the family, and was quite unnecessarily still going on in the present, causing him all the pain we had observed and the impossibility of his letting go of his childhood ties in the way that Jung writes about them. I should like to stop with this happy ending of Larry's reconciliation with both his external and internal father, and point out that it allowed him to recover his lost self-confidence as well as his brilliant intellectual capacity. He continued his studies and went on to study and become a film director, thus finding his own way of succeeding and pleasing his parents, whom he could now love as well as hate when he became angry with them. He did not need to sacrifice himself any longer. His therapy had set him free. Although this has been only a brief and partial description of Larry's analysis, I would now like to talk about Elizabeth, who, too, felt that she needed to sacrifice herself in order to protect her unstable and unhappy mother when Elizabeth's father left her. Beth was 17 years old at the time of her referral. I saw her for about 9 months during her last school year once a week. She had asked her mother, who was in therapy, to inquire about treatment for her as she felt that things at school were worrying her. She was an outstandingly brilliant student at her grammar school, praised and supported by her teachers and the students, as she was willing to help her friends when they were in difficulties. Everybody considered her a perfect girl. She was a child from a mixed marriage between a European mother and an Asian father. She had a lovely face with light brown complexion and long black hair with soft, deep oriental eyes. Although considerably overweight, she moved elegantly and with poise. She spoke in a soft, calm voice which would become shrill and extremely piercing when under the pressure of emotion. Her body, however, conveyed to me an impression of primitive fear. She giggled when embarrassed and tended to withdraw if she felt that I was being too direct, as if scared by my penetrating insight. Her father was the most distressing aspect of her life. She was the only daughter of her parents' common-law marriage, but her father was a Muslim and had another wife and family in his own country, to which he returned periodically, often for years at a time, until he came back full of guilt and of affection for them. Everything went well until the next time he departed. The mother had had a difficult childhood with the loss of her own mother when she was a child, very unstable and infantile in her emotional reactions. She could not tolerate her husband's long absences and his double life, but neither could she leave him. She began drinking and had attempted suicide when driven to extremes, which brought her husband back to her. This actual life situation and the inability of the parents to decide whether to separate or continue to live together caused Beth a great deal of pain, and their violent and passionate fights in her presence scared her so much as a child that it was now impossible for her to express any murderous violent feelings whatsoever. She had become the parent of the infantile parts of her parents, with the result that she felt there was nobody who could take care of her own infantile needs and distress. Her self-containing capacity and her identification with the holding mother was locking her child self in a desperate isolation. She demanded too much from herself, and in this she was supported by her outstanding intellectual abilities and by her incredible capacity for work and her determination. Until her final school year, she had managed to keep the distressed and scorned baby inside her, tucked in and out of reach. But with the A-level examinations impending, her anxiety made her defensive system crack, and some difficult feelings had begun to leak through from the unconscious. This, of course, had been fostered by the de-integrative process related to adolescence, which she was trying to fight with all her strength for fear of becoming like her mother, which to her meant becoming emotionally incontinent. In the transference it soon emerged that she had to please and impress me all the time, and I could not reach her baby part, which she kept projecting onto her parents. It felt as if I could only provide a place for her where she could unload some of her complaints about her mother and father, and so receive a sympathetic understanding. As the therapy proceeded and she became convinced that I knew what a good girl she was, a less perfect girl began to emerge. She began to mess about with the times of her sessions, forgetting to come, and then suddenly turning up at the wrong time and getting upset if I would not see her. She was behaving like her father, who used to return home unexpectedly, and I was supposed to behave like her mother, who allowed him back on his own terms. The fact that I would not allow her to see me except at her appointed times made her angry, and she would not accept it. For a while she stopped seeing me, with the excuse that she was too busy with her examinations. I wrote her a note saying that we ought to discuss whether she should terminate analysis, and left it at that. Her mother became anxious about Beth's not seeing me and tried to intervene. I supported the girl's decision, saying that she had the right to decide for herself, but that I would like to discuss the issue with her and not with her mother. This made the mother feel rejected by me, and she went to see the director of the clinic where I worked and angrily accused me of not taking her daughter's situation to heart. Eventually Beth returned to me just after her 18th birthday, when her father was due to return. In the session, she talked about her fear that her parents would begin having rows again, in which she hated being made to have to take sides. For instance, her father had written to her saying that he could not return if she wanted him always, like her mother did, as he could not stay with them all the time. She said she felt differently from her mother. She would genuinely be happy to see him return, and she wished only that he could take her with him to visit her step-brothers and step-sister in his own country. She said her father feared she was on her mother's side, but she wanted to tell him that she was not. She loved them both, but hated them when they wanted her to take sides. She felt she was being used as a judge by both parents, and so she wanted to be left alone and free by them. But she was also worried in case they killed each other during one of their violent fights if she was not there to stop them. I commented that in not coming to see me, she wanted to test out my reactions as to whether I could tolerate letting her go, or whether I would get in an emotional state like her mother, or violently angry like her father. At the next session she was much more subdued. She told me immediately that her father was arriving earlier than expected. She had been unable to sleep for excitement and fear. She looked confused and was tearful and tensed up as she spoke. I asked her what made her so scared. She was scared for her mother's safety, she answered, and burst out crying. It slowly emerged that her father had in the past beaten his wife up, and on one occasion had even followed her around the flat, brandishing a chopper, possessed by jealousy and threatening to kill her. The fear and helplessness Beth had experienced then still paralyzed her now, and while she was recalling this, she went white in the face and began to feel sick. I said that she was re-experiencing now the awful fear of the past, and this was why she had felt so bad about the news of her father's return. She was surprised that the distant memory could still be so strong in her mind. She paused, and then said that her father with the chopper in his hand was a terrifying image. In Beth's case, this terrifying image of the archetypal bad father had been experienced in reality. It was therefore understandable why she could not let go of her violent feeling. The violent reality had prevented her from experiencing in fantasy her wish to kill the parents when she felt persecuted by them, and only now could she begin to let go of her fear and her pain. However, in reality, the father's visit went well. She was able to talk to him, and together they made plans for Beth's move to university, which her father was very proud of and warmly supported. She wanted to become a doctor, and applied for a place in a medical school outside London, taking advantage of her father's help. In the meantime, the parents decided to sort out their relationship, and finally the father returned again to his own country, from where he kept in good contact with Beth. The mother was helped by her therapy, and eventually was able to let go and come to terms with the breakup of her marriage. Beth now began to talk about her impending examinations, and spent many sessions discussing her own worries in relation to the present situation, her school friends, her weekend job, and finally a boy who seemed to find her attractive. She had begun to move away from the violent primal scene. Now she was able to concentrate on her own worries, appropriate to her age. She had found a support in a male teacher at school who was good to her and praised her a great deal. When it was time for her examinations, she appeared sad to leave the school and her friends, particularly her teacher. I related this to myself and the approaching termination of her therapy, and she was able to admit that the work we had done together had helped her. She did well in her examinations and was accepted by one of the best medical schools in the country. Before leaving, she came to say goodbye. She looked quite different. She was an attractive young lady now, slimmer, well-dressed, and much more aware of her femininity and her looks. She told me she had a boyfriend, and while the problems with her mother were still present in reality, she now dealt with them differently. She could now leave her mother, as she was no longer felt responsible for her mother's survival. She had to get on with her own life. Conclusion. In this paper, I have focused on adolescence in relation to the de-integrative-reintegrative processes of the self, and the need for the ego-self axis to be readjusted following the massive changes occurring at this stage of life, related in the main to sexual developments. Starting from Jung's views and the attention he gives to the symbolic constellation of adolescence, I go on to discuss the theme of detachment from the parents and of the heroic deeds and the sacrifice which are related to adolescence' unconscious conflict and manifest themselves in the actual manner in which young people act at this stage of their lives. Following Fordham's view of adolescence as a stage of turbulence, the roots of which lie in infancy, I linked up de-integrative processes with the archetypal images of heroes and hero worship in adolescence, when collective heroes take the place of the parents, the heroes of the past. I then shift the focus on to the regression-progression dynamism inherent in the adolescent conflict, from which the two unconscious fantasies of the death of the child and the murder of the parental couple spring to consciousness. For without the death of the old symbols, adolescence proper, that is to say, the coming apart from the parents, cannot take place. After examining the role played by the parents in facilitating or preventing the young person's detachment from past dependency on them, I introduced the cases of a boy and a girl, both of whom had remained stuck in an infantile relationship with the parents, and were unable to proceed further because of a negative father complex which had become constellated in their unconscious as a consequence of the father's absence from them or lack of interest in them as small children. In the absence of the real father, the image of the bad, terrifying father had paralyzed them, keeping them attached to the mother, whom they both felt they had to protect from the violent attacks of the murderous father. During the course of the analyses of both of them, some of their own anger and violence in relation to their parents was worked through in the transference-countertransference, and this constellated the image of the good father analyst. This subsequently allowed them to free themselves from the grip of the negative primal scene fantasies in which they had been locked, and in this way they were both able to move on in their own right.